Hallo meiner Schüler, heute werden wir decken Kapitel 6, die Verfassung und die neue Republik. Können beginnen. Our first form of government is actually Confederacy, where we're following the document, the Articles of Confederation in the United States of America, or as 7th Art knows it, as the United Provinces of Columbia. Even though people were really afraid to have a strong central government where the central government has all the powers, most people were dissatisfied with the Confederation where the states have more power than the national government. It was really ineffective. The Articles were very weak, as you can see with this PowerPoint. So what made them so weak? They could not promote trade. They have no power to levy taxes. There was a lot of social unrest, and there's no central government to really control it because all that's at the central government is one unicameral legislative branch that has to have a unanimous vote on every single thing that's done. They had major Indian complex, they had no type of currency, and they had a huge war debt. So they had a major problem. They couldn't really do anything about it with the Articles since the states had the power, not the national government. After the event of Shays Rebellion, which Daniel Shays led a bunch of farmers to the Massachusetts courthouse because he did not want his farm to be foreclosed upon, he was sick of having to pay all these fees, the government did nothing. So they didn't have the power to do anything. So the founding fathers got together and they were like, you know, we kind of need to do something about this because we can't do anything right now. So they had the Annapolis Convention where a whole heap and 12 people showed up, and they met together and said, look, we need to change the Articles. It was led by J. Mads and Hambone, and they said, we got to change the Articles. So let's set up a meeting in the summer of 1787 where we can change the Articles. But when they didn't know was how much they were going to be changed. When they met in the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia, which is now known as Independence Hall, in the summer of 1787, there was a lot of different type of people that were coming there. They mostly, though, were younger, educated, and rich. Some of the people that were included were Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Benjamin Franklin, who was older at the time. He was in his 80s. The Virginia Plan was something that they wanted to try to figure out how to set up the legislature. That was the first idea. They just realized when they got there that they were just going to have to throw the Articles completely out of the window because they just didn't work. So the way to fix the legislature was Madison and Edmund Randolph's idea that, hey, why don't we make a two-tier legislature? We've got the lower house and the upper house, which would make it a bicameral legislature. And the voting would be based on population. Well, of course, it favored the large states because the large states would get more representation. So this started one of the major conflicts there, which was the small state versus the large state conflict, because the small states didn't think that was very fair, where the large states thought it was completely fair. Hi. So, remember how we talked about the Virginia plan? The New Jersey plan was the opposite plan for the small states, where everybody would get equal representation and there'd be only one house. Well, as much as they hated each other, opposites attract, and the New Jersey and the Virginia plans fell in love and got married, and they had a baby known as the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. And this one said that there would be a two-house legislature, the upper house having equal representation, 2 per state, and that is known as the Senate, and the lower house, the House of Representatives, would have representation based on population. So the big states like that one. This is also the House of Representatives, the only one at the time that can be directly voted on by the people. The Senate would be voted on by the state legislatures. The president, of course, would be voted on, and still is today, by the Electoral College, and the federal judges would be nominated by the president and approved by the Senate. So, who is the architect of the Constitution? It's James Madison. It's J. Mads, this little guy. He is the father of the Constitution because he made the foundation for it. And one of the things that he had to ask himself when helping to create this is who has sovereignty? Well, first of all, he believes in popular sovereignty, where we, the people, rule. But when it came to who should have the power, the state governments or the national governments, he said, let's make both sides happy. Instead of a super strong central government or only power at the states, which didn't work under the Articles, let's have it split, where the federal government and the state governments both share power. It's just that we're going to see the federal government have the final say in case there's ever a dispute. He also wanted to realize, okay, at the national level, how do I make it so they don't become too powerful? One branch doesn't become too powerful. So he created the idea of separation of powers, which gave the legislative branch the power to make laws, the executive branch the power to enforce laws, and the judicial branch the power to interpret laws. Why are you laughing? The Madisonian model is what frames our Constitution. It is the foundation of it, is the principles of it. So what are the 6 principles of our Constitution according to the Madisonian model? Number 1, federalism. It's the separation of powers between state and national government. Number 2, the separation of powers. That has to do with separating the powers at the national government into the 3 branches of government. Third is checks and balances, where each branch has the power to check another branch of government. Like if the president doesn't like a bill that the Congress has proposed, he has the right to veto it. Also, popular sovereignty. Sovereignty is the right to rule. Who's the popular? Who's the populace? It's we, the people. We have the right to rule. Not too much, so of course, because why would they want us to do that? Judicial review is the idea that the judicial branch decides on the final constitutionality of law, and limited government says that the central government cannot be all-powerful, which all of these actually kind of intertwine together, as you will see. Not everybody agreed on the Constitution. There are many people that were against it, but there are people for it, of course, and those are the Federalists, and the ones who were against it were known as the Anti-Federalists. And they needed to convince people to get on their side. So the Federalists published a large collection of essays known as the Federalist Paper, written by people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, or the ghost name of Pluribus, who basically was just James Madison, basically trying to get people to support the Constitution and their side of the government. But the Anti-Federalists were against it, and their biggest complaint was that there was no Bill of Rights to protect our civil liberties. All that was in the Constitution at the time was the preamble, which just showed the purpose of government, and the articles, which gave the structure of the government, but no actual Bill of Rights to protect our personal liberties. And it was debated. It did go quickly because states like Virginia and New York, who were heavily populated with the Anti-Federalists, agreed to sign it and ratify it as long as it did contain a Bill of Rights. And it would get one immediately following the ratification of it. Now that the new government has been ratified and approved, we have the new Constitution, we need to figure out what to do to complete the structure. So like I said, the Bill of Rights was added to protect our civil liberties against the national government. And President Washington decided that he needed some advisors to help him, so he created the cabinet. These things, the cabinet was never mentioned in the Constitution. It's just something that he did to help him out. So they are presidential advisors. The first 4 were the Secretary of State, who takes care of foreign affairs, Secretary of War, which has recently, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, got changed to the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Treasury, and the Attorney General, who is in charge of the Department of Justice. Right now we're seeing the first signs of political parties with the 2 factions known as the Federalists and the Republicans. Let me be clear on this. The Federalists now are more of a political party. They are not the Federalists that we saw who wanted to ratify the Constitution. Also, the Republicans are really known as the Democratic Republicans, but for a time they went by the Republicans. This is not the same Republican Party that we see with Abraham Lincoln on. They are 2 different parties that we're seeing at the beginning. The Federalists were more believers in a strong central government, and they got most of their support from urban areas, and their major leaders were Hamilton. George Washington didn't like factions, didn't like political parties. He thought that they were evil and tyrannical, but he supported a lot of the beliefs of the Federalists. The Republicans favored more of state governments and rule by the people. They got most of their support in rural areas, and it was led by Thomas Jefferson and a little guy. When it came to Hamilton and the Federalists, he felt that the first thing that they should do is assume all state debts and at the national level, and he would take them at face value. He thought that by doing this, it would get the states out of a bind, and that the central government really needed to take care of the debt, not state governments, because they wouldn't know what to do and might not get it done the way he would want it to be done. When he also produced his report on manufacturing, he also believed that the way to earn money besides loaning out money through a national bank was to tax people using excise taxes on liquor and things that are luxury items, and to draw a protective tariff up for imported goods. No income taxes at the time. So the South didn't really like Alexander Hamilton's plans. Like, And since the capital of the country was New York City, Alexander Hamilton's like, hey, I'll move it closer to you guys, or between Virginia and Maryland. They're like, okay, we'll agree to you, yay! So they agreed to what he wanted. At the same time, Alexander pushed and got his national bank approved, which was the first bank in the United States. Very, very original name. And with this bank came a 20-year charter, so he got to do it for 20 years, and then they would see how it worked and if they would renew it or not after those 20 years. It was very controversial because nowhere in the Constitution does it directly say that you can create a bank for the United States. So people are a little bit upset about this. And this is when we started seeing two different groups emerge, strict versus loose constitutionalists. Strict one says you need to follow the Constitution word for word. These would be people like Thomas Jefferson. Loose constitutionalists, like the Federalists, were loose constitutionalists. They believe that the national government can read between the lines, and they use Clause 18 of Article 1, Section 8 that says that the Congress can do anything if they feel it's necessary and proper, and he felt that this was necessary and proper to have a bank. In the Federalist Papers, J. Mads, little guy, he talks a lot about factions and how they were bad but inevitable. And what is a faction? It's just a group of people who have similar beliefs. Well, many people thought at the time that factions were really bad. They feared them because they felt they were dangerous and would lead eventually to tyranny and one group taking over the country. But you can't help it. They're inevitable, especially in a republic where people have the freedom of speech and have civil liberties. So the faction system actually created the first two-party system in the United States, which were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, or the DRs, or the Republicans, whatever you want to call them. Please note that they're not the same as the ones that we see today. But it was good because it was a way to organize people's visions. National government was going to have some tests they were going to need to face. The first one was that of the Whiskey Rebellion, where Western Pennsylvania farmers were a little upset because they didn't want to pay the whiskey tax and they had a rebellion. So Washington raised an army and led the troops to stop the rebellion himself. This is the first time this has ever happened. But what's the importance of this event? That this is the first case where we're going to see the national government showing their new power. So people will realize that they really can't be messed with. They also had to figure out what to do with Native Americans, and they decided that any type of treaty that was made under the Confederation that they would have to honor and still follow. But they were seen as tribes. They were not seen as nations, and they were not allowed to be citizens of the United States. But we're still going to see some major conflict arising because of overland. People keep moving further and further west and encroaching on Indians' land, so they're not going to really honor these treaties that were made with them. And there are many battles with them, and one of them was the Battle of Falling Cinders, where they were fighting with white settlers over the land. Indians did surrender and did cede the land, so it was something that the white settlers won. Right now, we're kind of seen as a joke to the rest of the world. They really aren't taking us seriously, so we had to figure out ways for them to take us seriously. In 1793, the French and the British were having a war, and they both asked us to take their sides, and we didn't really want to take one side or the other because we wanted to have good relationships with both. So we decided to go on the path of neutrality. And they really didn't like it, but there was nothing they could do. But the French sent over a man that we call Sedition, who tried to get the Americans on his side. And again, they didn't really see us as something to take seriously. So instead of going directly to Washington, Sedition went to the southern part of the United States, went to Charleston, South Carolina, to just round up military help down there rather than talking to Washington. And not only did we get upset, but the British got upset because they thought we were a part of this. They didn't understand that we weren't happy with this, so they started seizing our ships because of what Sedition was doing. And that, of course, not only made us bitter towards the French, but also bitter towards the British. So we needed to figure out something. We needed to make some type of treaty with them to kind of make sure that we don't have a war. So we have John Jay going over to Britain to make Jay's Treaty, which basically established our sovereignty in the Northwest, which is currently the Midwest, and it basically made it so we didn't get into a war with Britain over all of this. But we also had some issues with borderlands and the use of the Mississippi River with Spain. So we sent Charles Pinckney over to Spain to resolve border conflicts with them, not only on the border between Georgia and Florida, but also the use of Mississippi and New Orleans. G-Dubs is out. He decided, I'm not going to run again. He set the precedent of only 2 terms for a president. Get it? And then, of course, we're going to see that the Antichrist later on is going to not pay attention to that at all. So, who is running for president? We are seeing John Adams, his vice president, run. He's a Federalist versus Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican. And Adams did win. He got first place. Thomas Jefferson got second. And back then, whoever got first became president. Whoever got second became vice president. Well, we're going to see that that's not going to work very well in the upcoming future. So Washington, on his way out, he wrote his bye-bye speech, the farewell address, where he basically warned the United States against two major dangers. And the two major dangers that he felt were going to hurt us were political factions and foreign influence. So he basically promoted isolationism, and he promoted neutrality and no political parties. But it wasn't going to happen. He might think that way, but the majority of the country felt that they needed a political party in order to organize their ideas. We just almost got into a war with Britain. We averted that. Now we're going to pretty much almost get into a war with France. This is known as the QuasiWar, and I'll talk about that in a second. But here's what happened in the first place. We were trying to make negotiations with France because they were starting to seize our ships because we weren't really getting along, because we were helping out the British and they didn't like the British, so they seized our ships to stop them from going to Britain. Well, the Federalists wanted war. They're like, this is not cool. We want war. We want to take them out and show them who's boss. But John Adams, president's like, no, we need to use diplomacy, not defense. So they sent 3 diplomats over to France to talk to them about this whole thing about seizing American ships. And they met up with 3 French agents who were known as Agent Monsieur X, Y, and Z, who basically demanded bribes for negotiations. And of course, that really ticked us off. That made us upset. So it led to the QuasiWar. Quasi means semi. It was an undeclared naval war versus France. So this is when we first start seeing our Navy get created as well. And ultimately, France did choose to negotiate averting a full-blown war. So when we said quasi, it's kind of semi. We talked about this war where it's like, oh, I'm bringing it on. Kind of. It's on maybe, kind of, sort of. But luckily nothing, no one really got hurt out of this, on our side at least. One of the more controversial acts created at that time was the Alien and Sedition Acts. It was a 2-part act. The part 1 was the sedition, where we're looking at seditious speech is speech that's spoken against the government, and they were trying to make it illegal, which is wrong because of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Well, why did the Federalists pass it? Because they wanted to stifle the Democratic Republican opposition. So that's a great way to stop it. So anytime that anyone muttered a word against the government, they would get in trouble for it, whether they got thrown in jail or fined or whatever. So that's awesome. It would just be like today if the Democrats, who are for the most part in charge, would pass a law that said any Republican or anybody in general who says something bad about Barack Obama or Democrats, Harry Reid, whoever, would get thrown in jail. You can kind of see why that's not really legal. But the Supreme Court really didn't use its power of judicial review at the time. Now, the Alien Act was about immigrants, and they restricted immigration, and meaning letting so many of them in. Well, people got ticked off about it, and no one was doing anything about it. So Virginia and Kentucky said, we're going to do something about it. And basically, Republicans like James Madison and Thomas Jefferson said, this is wrong, and we feel like that anytime the government's doing something illegal, we have the right to nullify it or void that national law. So this is where we start seeing states' rights versus national rights. And we're going to see more of that as time goes on, and it's going to come to a head at the Civil War. And then in 1800, we had the Revolution, where we have the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, where Thomas Jefferson is going to win. Aaron Burr is going to be his vice president. Why is it a revolution? For several reasons. We're going to see a completely different type of presidency with Thomas Jefferson, which we'll see in the next chapter. And this is the first time in the history of the world that the change of power to an opposite party was done peacefully. But right before Adams got out, he realized that he was losing power. The Federalists were losing their power. They were losing their steam. So he tried to appoint what he called what were dubbed as the Midnight Judges, where right before he got kicked out of office, he tried to appoint as many Federalist judges he could to both the Supreme Court and federal courts. Okay. So the election of 1800, like I said, it was John Adams versus the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson. The Electoral College, actually, they each get 2 votes. So when he ran with Aaron Burr, they decided to run together. They each got 73 electoral votes. So they had to go to the House of Representatives to pick them. Jefferson won. Aaron Burr was become vice president, even though Aaron Burr tried to kind of screw Jefferson over and take that position. So like I said before, at the very end, this lame duck Congress and president got this Judiciary Act of 1801 passed, which it was allowed them to add Federalists to the judicial branch. They wanted at least one branch to have Federalists dominating it. These were the midnight judges, since they were added at the last minute. But Madison, James Madison, the Secretary of the State at the time, refused to allow some of them in, including Charles Marbury. So they took him to court in Marbury versus Madison. This is the first time we see the Supreme Court say that the act was unconstitutional. This is their time that they show their power of judicial review. This is one of the top 5 most important Supreme Court cases of all time. Make sure you know this one. All right, Thorson, torch out.